Okay, let's get started again. I did post the lecture up to Blackboard, although I did so just recently. But it is up there. It's still under lecture 2 because one of the things that's happening is I'm running a little behind on my lectures, which is not a big deal. We'll catch up. But we're running a little bit behind now. So just to recap where we are. Lots of people develop lots of really dumb products, and we don't want to be one of them. Here are some examples, and lots of times it's just really from lack of knowledge about what customers want and customers need. And thankfully, people who study things like psychology and so forth get quite good at understanding what people want and need because, for one, they observe them, for two, they ask them, for three, they do surveys and questionnaires and all of those kinds of things. So that's one of the reasons, in case you're wondering why you're taking those kinds of classes, taking stats and so forth, that's the reason. At least somebody in the company has to be good at doing this kind of thing, and that ought to be you. So people have blown it in all kinds of ways. But it seemed important to start talking about the main points of product development, what happens during the system development, that is. And we talked briefly about understanding the objectives and performance. We talked then about definition of the system a little bit. Then basic design and what are the things that human factors people and so forth do during basic design. That included understanding human performance requirements, conducting task analyses, doing job design, etc. And generally these things are done iteratively. That is, you don't just start in one and sort of march down the path and that one thing is always done. You often come back to it as you learn new things. So these cycles are really important, and there's a common sort of term that people use in industry nowadays in relation to iteration. And that is that the idea is to fail early and fail often. So as you're developing things, this is true of writing theses, by the way, too, get stuff out quickly and test it, and then find out where the problems are. Now the key is the quickly part, because if you just get it out slowly and then get it to real honest-to-goodness users in the marketplace, well, your brand will suffer because you'll get to be known for poor quality. It'll also be very expensive and so forth. But if you can build these prototypes and get them in front of users in a research kind of environment, well, then you can debug the usability problems and the desirability problems and all those kinds of things fast and cheap. And when I first started in this business, prototyping wasn't as fast as it is now. There wasn't 3D printing, all of those kinds of things. So when we created a prototype, it took a long time. And as a result, you couldn't iterate really fast. There was always a limitation. You always had to wait for the prototype. Nowadays, prototypes are, just like sheets of paper. You can just wad them up and throw them away and start on another one, at least when it comes to software, but often even when it comes to hardware with 3D printing and so forth. So the idea is to fail early, fail often, and I'll add the third, fail fast. Because failure is just kind of a temporary situation. Eventually you get to success. But you ought to recognize that first you're going to go through this sort of iterative nature, much like writing a book or anything else. Your first drafts will not be lovely. They'll not be wonderful. So that's the basic, some of the basic design stuff. We covered all of these things. And then we got to our story about the McDonald's McDLT. And then, so we were talking about this part in here during interface design. What are the things that a human factors person is doing during this period? Really, so if you're thrown into GoDaddy, for example, or if you're thrown into Intel or any number of other places, and you're at a certain part during product development, how do you know what you're supposed to be doing? Well, if you are doing things like interface design, there's a number of ways that you can be providing value. Some examples are doing lit reviews on sort of good user interface design and standards. So for example, and this is something that a lot of interface designers don't do, simply because either they don't know they exist or they're comfortable with their own sort of aesthetic sensibilities. But there's a fair amount of data dedicated to, well, where do we put certain buttons? Where do we, what color font should we use? What size font should we use? What contrast should we use? And so on. And we'll get into some of that here in our class. But that's a way that we can be providing value at that point, because other people won't be doing it. That literature will have information that includes the principles based on research and experience that are out there. They'll have mathematical functions and equations to use. So for example, the common one that you'll hear about and we'll cover in class includes Fitts' law, for example. Basically, how large should you make a button or some target that you want to press as a function of how far you have to move. So if it's nice and close to you, you can make a nice little small button, and how fast you have to move. So this law sort of plots out how fast you can make a decision, how fast you can press something as a function of distance and size of the thing you need to press. Well, that's a pretty helpful thing for somebody to know about. So we'll cover Fitts' law in this class. There's also other things like Hicks' law. Hicks' law is how fast can one make a decision based on the number of alternatives that are available to you at that time. Well, that's pretty important too when you're trying to figure out how sort of dense do we want to make a screen. Do we want it to have lots of white space, or do we want it to be covered in information? And it depends on the task to some degree, but Hicks' law helps you describe what that function is. How long does it take to make the appropriate choice as the number of choices increase? And that matters for certain things. So these are some of the ways you'll be providing value. Others will just be expert judgments. The notion is that while other people are off doing other things, they'll certainly have opinions about designs, but designs and how people interact with them will be your specialty. So you'll have all kinds of time. In fact, it'll be your job to think about designs and how people interact with them. So you'll have expert judgments just from more and more experience and hanging out with other people who have more and more experience. There are design standards and criteria. One of the groups I just joined, or got put on their board, I guess, is a group called Exertia. And this group they come up with guidelines and standards for mobile apps for healthcare. And the idea is everybody's running around building these mobile apps for healthcare, which is absolutely wonderful. But the design standards are terrible. Everybody's making all kinds of mistakes. It's kind of designed willy-nilly. They don't have a very good sort of standard that they can follow. So the American Medical Association, American Heart Association, a group called HIMSS, which is a health informatics group, all got together and are pulling this kind of thing together. There are checklists that will be useful for you to go through and use to evaluate things like user interfaces and systems and so forth, and we'll talk about some of those. There are walkthrough evaluations, or what I called, without telling you guys, in the most recent reaction paper, sort of inspection methods. So these are things where you're inspecting it, and you're going in with your expert judgment and maybe a checklist and so forth, or a set of heuristics. And you're going through and evaluating the product. So you're not necessarily collecting data from human beings yet, because that takes time and money and effort. But you're just going through and using your knowledge and maybe one or two checklists or guidelines to identify problems with the product. And then finally, human performance studies. Now you guys will be trained more than you can stand it, especially HSE folks, in human performance studies. So you'll be collecting data on all kinds of crazy stuff. Sometimes there'll be teams, sometimes there'll be golfing, sometimes there'll be people in a batting simulator, sometimes there'll be stuff about brands, just everything. And the idea is you might not even be interested in golfing or brands or whatever. That doesn't matter. It's the notion that you're going through and collecting these data, and you know how to do it, you know how to avoid a confound, you know how to, when to use standard deviation versus standard error of the mean and why, all of those kinds of things. That's good stuff for you guys. So that's what we should be doing during interface design. Yeah, the problems keep coming. So this was, do you guys remember this one? WOW chips have something called Olestra in them. So the idea was these were fat-free chips. The only problem is when you ate them, they gave you the runs. So it was really bad. They came up with various names from them and so forth. They had to pull them off the market. And I mean, they had something in there that said, well, this might, be difficult on your stomach or whatever. But I mean, people were having problems. So that didn't work out very well. I don't know if a human factors person could have detected this, but it's a good possibility. At least they might have raised the red flag if they knew that Olestra tended to cause gastrointestinal difficulty. So as we're thinking about all this stuff, we need to understand what a user interface is. And if you ask lots of different people, they'll give you lots of different responses. So what's a user interface?
It's what the user comes in called.
Yeah, you saw it, but no, you're right.
No, but I actually know that.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, the idea because if you ask people off the street, they'll usually say, well, it's that thing on your phone or that thing on your computer or whatever. But I think that the idea here with a user experience and a user interface is the notion that we are designing everything the user comes into contact with. So that will be, everything physically, everything perceptually, everything they see, and cognitively. That is everything they sort of understand about what we're creating. So those are kind of our areas. Of course, there it is. And thanks. I knew you knew this ahead of time. It even includes what in the book they called facilitator design. So a facilitator design would be things like guidebooks and training. And that the instructions when you're putting together your IKEA furniture, that's a facilitator. It might not be a very good facilitator, but it's a facilitator. Or maybe it's a hinderer, I don't know. But these are material that sort of promote human performance. And it turns out that these things are really important to the overall sort of experience one has with the product. Let's see if I can, I'll give you some examples as we go along. But it's all these things, instruction manuals, performance aids, training devices, and so forth, are absolutely critical. So we've done some good stuff. As you know, I show examples where we're proud from time to time. This was an example of a facilitator design. It wasn't the product itself, it was the packaging for the product. And so in that sense, the packaging sort of facilitates our experience with the product. And it wasn't just that we did this little hole here, which had never been done before, but it was a nice beefy kind of a cardboard. It felt substantial. And then I think I told you before, but when you opened it up, it actually, and this hadn't been done before, it actually had text written on it, encouraging you to use this box for all kinds of things that you might want to store. And then we had a graphic designer or brand designer that was a pretty clever person, and she described all of the various things you could put in there. Your jewelry, your papers, your thing, just don't put your goldfish in here. And it was just kind of this nice way of facilitating the experience, and people would keep it. And they hadn't usually done that before. If they kept it out of the way. But it's a reminder, one of the things you want is more face time with your brand. So the more time your brand spends in front of people, well, the better for your company, and this sort of facilitated that. Even this thing here was a facilitator. Without that thing, people wouldn't have known what to do with it. It's almost like training or almost like instructions. We just tried to keep it minimal. In other words, people had no idea when we did our testing, what the heck am I supposed to do with this, because they had never seen an automatic paper towel dispenser before. This was some time ago. And so we had to add this other thing, and I think I forgot what it says here, but there's obviously kind of a stylized hand that's moving, and it says, motion activated. Yep. Here, the idea was, yes, you are shocking somebody who's had a heart attack, However, you're going through and facilitating how they do it. Tell them exactly how to do those things. Here's an example that we've run into a lot. In fact, you guys might know Joe from, he was just testing this out prior to a study we were doing. One of the biggest problems is recently that our clients have had is FDA turns them down on their submission. So if FDA turns you down, that means you are not in the market, which could mean, you know, millions of dollars lost a month at least. And the FDA might turn you down because you've written the instructions for the product. Maybe the product works, but the instructions aren't very good. They're difficult for people to use. And so they've asked people recently to do all kinds of usability testing on their instructions. So here's an example of Joe doing that. Basically, in order to get through FDA, you need to do this. And then one of the things he's been doing recently, it's not shown here, but he will actually have eye tracking, wearable eye tracking equipment on his head. And the idea is, imagine somebody misses a step. So they're following the instructions and they screw something up, right? They don't do it right. Oh, we mark that down as a failure. That's, you know, a bummer. We try to understand why and so forth. There's really two reasons that it could be. One, they didn't see that particular step, right? They couldn't find it. The only other reason is they couldn't understand it. So which is it? Well, you can ask them afterwards, but subject report, especially after a task is over, can be a little hit and miss. Or you can look at the data from the eye tracker. And if the eye tracker shows that that person fixated on the piece of information that tells them how to do that task and they spent time looking at it, well, that tells us they saw it, but they didn't understand it. If, on the other hand, they didn't sort of fixate for a reasonable amount of time on that text, it tells us it was more of a findability problem. So now it tells us what to do. Do we have to simplify the text because they didn't understand it? Or do we need to make it more salient somehow so that they can find it? And this stuff hasn't been done yet, interestingly, because not enough sort of human factors people who are trained in these kinds of methods have focused on it. There's other things that are great indicators of how simple something is to read. For example, if you're looking at eye tracking, the number of times somebody regresses. So what that means is they read they read a sentence, and then they go back and read it again. And they go back and read it again, etc. If they do that several times, there's probably something wrong with your sentence. There's something confusing there. So you can look at the number of regressions. If there's a lot of these regressions, you know not only that you need to simplify your text, but you even have a pretty good idea of where you need to simplify it. So that's pretty good information that human factors folks would be doing throughout the design process. Then there's the usual testing and evaluation. Basically what you're trying to do is ensure adequacy. You might conduct experiments, for example, comparing an old model to a new model, or comparing your model to a competitor's model, etc. And this type of usability testing way down here in the end, and the testing and evaluation often is sort of, by this time you think you've got most of the usability problems worked out, and you should be thinking about validation testing. That is just ensuring that your product is good to go, that it's ready to go to the market, that it's ready to get submitted to FDA, whatever it requires. So hopefully you've done a lot of your other work ahead of time, and then this feels like it's just a formality. Okay. So Kagan and Vogel talked about a couple different ways of doing this stuff. And they said, and this is true of human factors because it really grew up working on huge systems like aircraft and defense systems and post office and things like that. If you're designing a really large system, say a Boeing, Dreamliner or something, chances are you follow a product development process that's something like this. And this is called the V process. So you start exploring concepts, you develop a management plan. I don't know what concept of operations means, but you develop the system requirements. Then you develop all the subsystem designs. Then you develop a detailed design of those things. And then you develop all the components. And then you start testing it. So that unit testing refers to that detailed design. That subsystem verification refers to that subsystem design, etc. System verification, validation, then there's operations and maintenance and changes and updates. But there's some things here that are interesting about it. It's very, very linear, right? You start at the beginning, and I know what I'm going to be doing, next month, and I know what I'm going to be doing a half a year from now, and I know what I'm going to be doing a year from now. And these kinds of time frames are, actually probably optimistic. I mean, a project like this could run over a decade, potentially. So first, this component is you're kind of decomposing and defining what you want this product to be. And then once you get to that point where you've sort of created all of the components, now you start putting it back together and making sure it works. So that is what they call a V process. And until recently, when most products were big products, people followed this kind of process. But this kind of process is really difficult. It requires a certain amount of fortune telling. Like, stuff that happens up here affects things down here, even if you discover new things while you're working on it. The thing is, you discover new things while you're working on it all the time, but you don't get a feedback loop back up here to change things. So that was the big problem with this V process. So, these are all the things I just told you about. Yeah. So there's another process one could use, which is a plan, do, check, act. I don't know that that's supposed to be there. I think that's supposed to be one of those hyphens. But, and that is used to enhance efficiency. But the nice part about this, that the V process was missing, is kind of a feedback loop, right? We're going to identify the problem. We're going to test out some solutions. We're going to check to make sure they actually met the solution. And then if it actually works, we're going to act on it. And then we might go around again, and we might go around again, and we might go around again. Very simple kind of iterative process. Now this works particularly well for things where you have to move fast, which is more common nowadays when you're doing software products. Even now, a lot of consumer products. You guys have even been using it at General Dynamics in a different variation, but this kind of iterative design, and they are designing very big things often. So that's a kind of straightforward way. Here's a way that's gained a lot of momentum recently, which is kind of the Scrum approach, which they talk about in the Lee book. And this is really common in software products. And it was based on something called the Agile Manifesto. And you might have to look up when exactly that was. But the Agile Manifesto was basically a number of pretty well-esteemed software engineers got together and tried to think about what really stinks about software development. What's really problematic about software development, and how do we go about fixing it? And one of their problems was, well, we get these changes at the end. And if I had just known about them at the beginning, life would have been so much better, and I wouldn't have had to work all night for weeks, and we would have saved a lot of money, and we would have met our deadlines. So is there a way that we can get feedback earlier on rather than later? That was one example. The other was, everything we work on is so big, maybe we could cut it down into parts and just crank that part out and have it and really, feel really confident about it, and then move on to the next thing. And then we can revisit it if we want to, but we'll carve them out and make sprints, basically they called them. So in this Agile Manifesto that they created, the model is something like this. They have this set of product backlogs. So this is products that they need to work on. These actually could be components of a bigger product, but they call them products. And then they take one of those, and then they've got several sprints that they want to do here. So these are sort of things that need to be done to achieve getting this product done. And then they do a sprint. That is, work their butts off for a short period of time, just on that. And during that sprint could be anywhere from a day to 30 days. And then over time, you develop at least a working component of that software. You add it into the software and it continues to develop and improve over time. But the notion is it always feels like you're getting something done. It always feels like there's a good start and a good end, but it also feels like you can go back and revisit things should you need it. So this has been implemented not only in software, but it's been implemented in service businesses and things like this. And chances are, wherever you go to work, they'll be using some kind of process like this. One of the keys for us in human factors is going to be to figure out where in the world we're going to fit in and what we're going to provide at each one of these places. And it's going to vary a little bit from place to place. Okay, so I have to admit, I think I mentioned this to you before, I have not worked in this environment. It really gained strength like almost the year I left industry. So, what am I missing? Anybody here work in a Scrum environment or an Agile environment?
Actually, I've heard that Facebook is sort of been famous for having one-day sprint cycles.
One day, I believe it.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it's kind of very hectic and stressful.
But you sure get a lot out of people during that time, I would think.
Typically, it's like a 15-day sprint cycle.
Yep.
And then you have to, every morning, like 10,
Yeah.
they have a meeting where you have to tell them what you're going to achieve in the day,
Yep.
what was the problem you faced yesterday,
Yep.
and what you're going to achieve the next day.
That's great. So that is something I've started doing with my business. We call it a daily huddle.
Yeah.
And we get together and basically ours is slightly different, but we say what's up, and what that means is what's happening in the next 24 hours, and tell me any place where you might be stuck. And the idea there is we're all together in one spot. It's just so easy to transmit information there. And it's kind of predictable. Yep.
So I have a question. I mean, I know you said you haven't worked in this
Yep.
kind of environment, but like, do you think it's important that the company that's doing this process has already kind of established a name for themselves? Because I feel like Facebook and like Snapchat and people like that kind of do
Yep.
this, but like Snapchat, for instance, over the summer did that like drastic change where it's like if Snapchat itself hadn't developed such a good name for themselves, I
Yep.
feel like it kind of would have failed drastically if people would have stopped using it.
It's a good question, but actually more startups are doing it even than people that have developed a name for themselves, I think. And I think it's just because startups have to move so fast that it's sort of required. It's also based on something called the Lean Startup. So it's booked by a fellow named Eric Ries, R-I-E-S-S, I think, maybe just one S, called the Lean Startup, that sort of points out, look, let's not throw all of our time and effort into this big thing in hopes that it's going to work, but let's do small concepts first and find out what he would sometimes call a minimal viable product, an MVP, and find out if that's reasonable, and then we'll build on it after that. That way, hopefully you get into revenue, that is, you get paid sooner, and you don't waste resources going down something people aren't going to buy. Yeah.
Scrum is also just one particular implementation.
Yeah.
Which I didn't really like about the way they took it.
Right, so tell us more, please, yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't know for certain, but I would assume that Facebook and Snapchat and whichever, they're probably not actually doing Scrum. They're probably doing something that's called Kanban.
Sure.
It's another implementation of taking those principles of
Yep.
working product versus documentation and fail
Yep.
fast often, all those kind of things.
Yep.
It's a different way of implementing.
Yep.
So there's a lot of other agile methodologies besides Scrum.
Good.
And so I thought it was a little interesting that they focused on Scrum instead of focusing on Agile.
So I think this might be the result of somebody who is writing this who's not working in industry.
Sure.
Because I thought that was weird too. So Kanban is an interesting idea, and it's kind of a component of this. And it's really this simple notion. I wonder if I put a picture of it in here. But my son got me interested in this when he was taking TEM classes here. But it's this idea that you almost have, it's not a to-do list, there's another name for it, but it's all these things over here, and you might consider them, things on a whiteboard or Post-it notes or whatever, and each one of these has something that needs to be done. In fact, this might, yeah. So this is basically an activity or a goal or something like that. And then somebody picks it up and it's in process, and they'll pick it up and move it over here just so people know where it is and who's got it, and then finally this will be completed or done. There might be one after this too.
Usually a review
Review, where does that go?
in between in process and done.
Thank
Like
you.
if I'm working on something, then
Yep.
my boss needs to review it and they either put it back in process for me to fix or it's done.
Thank you. And that's kind of my understanding is that's kind of this Kanban process. And it's surprising. So I've been using something called Trello. Has anybody used Trello? Trello uses this kind of strategy. I'm amazed at how easy it is. It's so sensible, I can't believe we didn't do it before. And then the nice part is usually anybody could come along and pick this up. We just know it needs to be done. So if somebody finishes their work early, their previous task early, and is wondering, oh, what should I be doing today? So, oh, okay, I'll go pick up whatever. There's probably cherry picking that goes on, where people pick only the funnest tasks or the shortest tasks and so forth, but whatever. There's problems with every process.
So just to clarify for this strategy, the
Yep.
items in the to-do
Yep.
section are not sequential, so anybody can just pick any activity as long as they do the to-do in process review done.
That's my understanding.
Okay.
It
Yep.
varies company to company.
Yeah, tell me
Sometimes
more.
Your boss will say this is the priority,
Okay.
so they are
We still
prioritized.
have to do like the same backlog grooming to like if there are dependencies and things like that.
Right.
Yep,
So
dependencies.
It doesn't work so well for the dependencies as it does. Like,
Yeah.
Scrum.
Yep.
But the main issue like with Scrum that I've experienced is we run on like 1 or 2 week sprints, and getting any UX in there is just impossible because a lot of our people who give us feedback are like policymakers, right? So they can't come here.
Right.
Come to our workplace like every 2 weeks and then give us the feedback. And,
Exactly.
You know, and so we're just doing this like clunky thing where we're trying to do some testing, but then like the sprint is already passed. And then,
Yep.
So it's actually quite frustrating.
It is. So that's the thing I've been worried about the most. I'm going to ask 2 people, if I can, to come give us some presentations on how to do this. One is Matt Schaufman, who I was talking with last night. He works for a company called Nudesic. And he has a UX group, and they have to integrate into these Scrum processes. And he and his team have developed some ways to sort of make sure you're front-loading research. So before everybody starts, doing this, making sure they're smart and have inputs and things about our users and customers. And then Dean Barker has also implemented this in a group of about 200 UX people at United Healthcare, and it might be nice to talk to him about it too. So I'll see if I can get him in. It's tricky, and that's the thing. These are sort of, and I wish they described it in this book. They're sort of categories of processes. They're not exact processes, and it sounds like, and I sort of saw this too, like Jessica pointed out, Scrum is kind of just one component of this. It's a bigger philosophy, a bigger movement, really, called Agile. And what's really interesting to me about Agile is it was really done for software engineering, and then it applies to so many things. Just for me as a business owner, there are times I look at this, I'm going, how come I'm not doing this every single day? And so I know there are ways to facilitate business based on this. Okay. So I think this is a lot of what we said. It requires matching the methods to the demands and opportunities. With short development time, there might be little opportunity for time-consuming human factors or user experience, and this is a problem. On the other hand, that's a rotten way to say things. So what are we going to do? Not do human factors? Not do user experience? So we've got to figure out a way. Either we do sometimes what's called discount user experience or discount human factors, like more inspection methods and less data gathering, simply because inspections are fast and data gathering is a little slow. We can plan ahead, so knowing that a particular version is supposed to be ready on a particular day, and we can have our several participants pre-recruited for that day. So there's some things like that. Then there's this would be the fourth one, which is related actually, although we and the gang, I think, talk about it as kind of an alternative, but it's this notion of human-centered design. And the idea behind human-centered design is just honor our user, treat them well, and treat them well by understanding them. Some people would call it having empathy for them. But it's the recognition that design has to meet our user needs and be compatible with people's abilities. It involves determining our user needs and involving users in all stages, studying the user's jobs, eliciting their needs, their tasks, etc. And it involves these kind of three basic phases. Understanding users, so that's all of our upfront work, understanding everything about them, their environment, their needs, their desires, their hassles. Creating prototypes, and then testing the heck out of those prototypes and fixing them in an iterative fashion. So you can see in some ways this fits nicely, especially the iterative part with agile development. The only part where it doesn't necessarily fit nicely is the timing. So evaluating the prototype can be done in a couple ways. One is with heuristic evaluations, one of our inspection methods that we talk about. And we'll probably get an example to walk through some heuristic evaluations, and the other are usability tests. Actually, and we definitely will do that. So using real honest-to-goodness users, conducting real honest-to-goodness tasks with a real honest-to-goodness prototype or product, and finding out, did they do it correctly or not? How long did it take them? What types of problems did they have? How do we fix it? That's kind of what a usability test does for you. So here's their approach of a human-centered design process. I have a little trouble reading this. I don't know if we start in the middle and go to the end, or if we start in the end and go to the middle.
Sure, it's in the middle because it's so short.
Well, I think that's what, okay, good. And I think that's what I decided, since the paper prototype was the first thing, I figured it must be it. So you start in the middle and iterate. These might be with concept statements and things like that. You get to things like a paper prototype very fast. A paper prototype might just show how the product works. It might include things like paper and Post-it notes and markers and things like that. And we'll actually go through an activity where we do some paper prototyping here. I think paper prototyping is underutilized. A lot of people go directly to electronic prototyping, and I understand why. But I think a good 4 hours, I say, of rapid, iterative paper prototyping saves weeks on the back end. Then you go to things like pre-production models, product release, and et cetera. But the idea is you're always creating, understanding, creating, and evaluating. So this is exactly the same as the thing I've been driving home, which is the notion of user-centered design. So it shouldn't surprise us that human-centered design and user-centered design are just about the same thing. So I added one other component to this. So it starts with our early and constant focus on the user and his or her tasks. That sounds a lot like understanding our users. Empirical evaluation of user performance with the system. That sounds a lot like creating a prototype and doing usability testing. And then the iterations, lots of iterations. And then I added a fourth, which is participatory design. And I'll walk through a case study where we've done participatory design. But this is getting somebody to, an end user, to sort of help design things with you for a period of time. And this might be particularly important when your user has a lot of knowledge that you don't have. So if you were trying to design, a diabetes display, a diabetes monitor, for example, and you didn't have diabetes, you weren't familiar with diabetes very much, Well, it might be useful for have a number of diabetes patients sit down and say, well, here are some examples of the kinds of things I would like to see. And as they sketch these out, you get an opportunity to ask them all kinds of questions about, well, why do you want to see that there? Well, you know, what should go next to it? Do you want to see this first, or do you prefer to see it further down after you click through a couple things? All of these questions you can ask them in a really directed way, and they can tell you why. So in that sense, they're not telling you how exactly to design the product. They're sort of telling you what they want. And since we're trying to get at wants and needs, that seems like a really important thing. It's just that you have something to focus on instead of just lobbing a question at somebody and having them sort of lob a question back at you, or an answer back at you. So we'll go through some examples of those. So let's talk a little bit about research. This stuff I would like you to know. I guess I want you to know all of this, but when I feel really strongly about something, I'll say, hey, I'd like you to know this. You can really think about user research as divided into 3 kinds of categories. In the beginning, especially when they're focusing early on the users and their tasks and all of that kind of stuff, you do what's called generative research. And generative research simply means you're trying to come up with ideas. Ideas of products to come up with can be willy-nilly, right? You're just sitting around and you think and an idea pops into your head, or you see somebody do something. In generative research, you're trying to be more systematic about the research. That is, you'll go off and you'll interview people, you'll do observation of people in their natural habitats, their natural contexts, etc., right? You will identify problems that they're having, places where they swear, people, places where they get frustrated, etc. Then you might do, I'll save task analysis for a minute. You might do participatory design. Ask them, oh, if you were to design this cockpit display, what would it look like? What things would you have on the front? What kinds of things would you click to get to other places? You will look at trends. What's happening socially? What's happening economically? What's happening technologically? What's happening demographically? Legislatively? All of those kinds of things help you generate ideas. So if you think about science and how this relates to science, the notion behind science is you start by observing the world. So these ideas scientific ideas usually don't just pop into your head, just willy-nilly. You observe the world, you encounter the world, and you do observation, and you notice things about it. Well, this is a systematic way of doing that kind of noticing. And they create design hypotheses, basically. And those design hypotheses you can then prototype, and then you can test, etc. So this is the idea. Some things will be generative. Other times we're evaluating a prototype, for example, or a product. Well, in that case, we do other things. We will do interviews, of course. Hey, how do you like this product? How does it compare to that product, etc. You'll do usability tests. I just told you what that's about, right? Real users, real products, real tasks. You might do things like walkthroughs, one of the inspection methods, or heuristic evaluations, one of the inspection methods. Put yourself in the user's shoes, for example, would be a walkthrough. And walkthrough, where are the places I could screw this up? Cognitive modeling, how similar is, for example, this, and we'll get into examples of this. This is preview, I guess. How similar is this information architecture to the user's mental model about how they think about things typically? And then experiential. Once the product, and it's amazing how little is done here, although it should be. Once the product is out in the store, once it's available to you and so forth, what's that experience like? The only time you've seen it up until that point was this idea in your head, this prototype that got better over and over, but you've never seen it in the context of where you buy it or when it's delivered to your home. That's called experiential research. And you use a lot of the same kinds of techniques, of course, but you might also sort of immerse yourself in it. And what I mean by that is go buy it yourself. What's the shopping experience like? What does it look like compared to the other things that are on the shelves? Does it blend in well? Does it stand out? If it stands out, does it stand out appropriately? Which one draws your eyes first? And this is true of every single product. We've done it for rakes. Rakes were one of the biggest ones. We did lots of immersion research. Rakes are boring, but since they're so boring, you need to make sure that your product somehow stands out from the other product. Anyway, so that's the idea. There's three ways of doing research or thinking about research, and they're related to stages. Early stuff is generally generative research where you're coming up with and refining ideas. Evaluative research, this is one we deal with probably most in this program, that people have you evaluate things and see how good it is, how bad it is, how to fix it. That's done here typically with a prototype, and experiential is when a product is already out the door, but that's really helpful for the next version. Okay. There's another distinction that will have you scratching your head from time to time. You wouldn't think it would, but it does. And that's the difference between qualitative research and quantitative research. So we know what quantitative research is typically. If we do a reaction time experiment, for example, how fast can somebody identify a character on a screen and press a button telling me that they identified it, and I record sort of how fast did that happen. That's a quantitative study. It involves all numbers for the most part. There's a lot of qualitative research out there too, though. Things like if you're interviewing somebody and they say stuff to you, that's helpful to know, right? So it's not that quantitative is better necessarily. Qualitative usually happens earlier in the design process, and quantitative happens later. But here are some different kinds. You can actually quantify a lot of what people say in interviews, right? So if you went through and said, oh, this person had this sort of sentiment, this thought, so I'm going to put that on a Post-it note and put it over here. Oh, this other person had that too. I'm put it on a Post-it note over here. Oh, this one did too. And you count up those Post-it notes, well then that can be quantitative. Yep.
It's funny that you said that you scratched your head at that. Sometimes I was looking at the table that was in the book, and it was said that heuristic evaluations was a qualitative.
Yep.
And I was like, I sort of see that.
Yep.
But I think it could be quantitative.
Of course it can. Yep.
That's why I was confused by it. I was like, okay.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah, and in fact, one of the projects we did in my lab years ago did heuristic evaluations on an endoscope, and then looked at the frequency of different kinds of violations. So there's violations of memory, there's violations of speaking the user's language, and the one that kept coming up was something called prospective memory. That is remembering to do something. And basically what it pointed out was that the people who were cleaning these endoscopes forgot to do things. So, and in a set of, it turns out there were 202 steps. In a set of 202 steps, especially if you get interrupted, you could forget to do the next thing. And that would mess up so we fixed the memory part. But it was exactly that. When we looked at all of these things and just quantified how many of each there were, we found out prospective memory was by far the most. And it told us where to focus our time and effort. Yep. So yeah, you can quantify that. And I think that's true. People can quantify all kinds of things. We'll talk about image collaging, which is weird, but I love it, actually. We can quantify stuff with image collaging even, but it's really that these are typically qualitative, and these are kind of typically quantitative. Okay.
Question.
Yes?
Is there any qualitative methods that are either very difficult or basically impossible to quantify? So I feel like in theory you could really quantify any of these qualitative methods.
I think you're right. Yeah, I don't think so. So in fact, one of the things I love to do, which is strange, is to quantify qualitative data. Yep. And then Rod's the same way. Rod likes to quantify qualitative data. But so for example, if you get interview information back from people, you can do text analysis that sort of indicates not only word frequency, but phrase frequency. You can take some phrases that have the same meaning and combine them together so that you're sort of getting sentiment, analysis, and then look at those frequencies. You can even look at the frequencies with which they're sort of mentioned together, co-occurrence we call this. And if they co-occur, like your product and sucks, well, that's pretty telling, right? And so we look for things like that. Even the stuff I told you about iOmega, because it's one of my favorite things, where we talked about Zippy the dog. We wouldn't have gotten that if we didn't quantify what was in our transcripts. Zippy came to the top all the time. And we ended up calling the product Zip. So yeah, you can quantify stuff. Yeah. And I think there's great fun in doing it too. So, okay, so here is, if you think about a simple way of thinking about how all of these different types of research methods fit together, this is one way of thinking about it. You will come out of this program and go into working, if you're not already there, with kind of a bag of tricks or a bag of methods that you know how to do. The big question, and part of the art, is understanding when to do what. And one of the things I've recognized over time is when we're at the university, usually we can do research with large numbers of people. Or if you're using MTurk, you can do research with large numbers of people. But usually in industry, you only have people for a very brief period of time, and you're trying to move really fast. So if you've got those people, let's not employ just one method, because one method sometimes isn't enough. So for example, I've decided that we can really look at what people say. That's almost most marketing research, traditional marketing research, like interviews and focus groups and questionnaires. Those are all based on verbal report. But verbal report, what people say and what they do, are often really different things. So from the what people say and what they do, example is people said they would like a McLobster sandwich. People said they would like New Coke. People said they would like skinless Kentucky Fried Chicken. It didn't work out very well. Let's see. So what people say and what they do are often very different things. So a lot of what people say was being done a lot by market researchers and some psychologists. Sometimes we'll focus on what people do as well. And by what people do, that's observational kinds of research. Sort of looking at things like ethnography, spending time with people in their work environment or wherever they're doing, using your product, or et cetera. And then the final one is this participatory design notion that I talk about. So this is things like sketching, collaging, getting people to create an artifact that helps you figure out what they want. And typically what I'm looking for here is converging evidence. If I just get evidence of what people say, I'm worried because I could have missed something. What they say might be different than what they do. If I start seeing the same patterns in what they do, I start feeling a little more confident. And the same thing is if they're providing information in what they make, the artifacts they create. If all of that is telling the same story, even with small numbers of users, I'm feeling quite a bit more confident. And then if they're telling different stories, it means I need to figure out what's going on here. I got to do some more digging. So that's this, what we call a say-do-make model. And I think people probably don't employ it enough. But this notion of converging evidence in science in general is really critical. If you can get I'll give you an example. If only one lab can find an effect in science, that's worrisome. If you try to replicate that effect in other people's labs, that is trying to get converging evidence from several different people, and they can't do it, well then that's a problem. If on the other hand you come up with some effect and they replicate it in Australia and they replicate it in Germany and they replicate it in Seattle, you can feel pretty confident. And that's sort of what we're doing here, except we're using different methods. Okay, so examples of this will be contextual inquiry. So in contextual inquiry, we're sort of combining two of these things. We're combining what people do, that is, it's a lot of observation, and what people say. We usually don't have them make things during this time, but this is contextual inquiry. And the idea behind this, first place, it's a really important method to be familiar with. It's a really important method to include on your resume. If you can include an example of some work you've done with contextual inquiry in your portfolio, it's really helpful. Just because it's kind of the workhorse of generative research. So what you do is you sort of immerse yourself in the environment where the person is working or doing whatever. And you interview and observe while they're there. So you observe the work that happens. I think those are the things we're talking about. There are 4 principles to it. One is context. It has to be where they are. Another is partnership. So one way of partnership is, I know when I go interview people, they get nervous. They're afraid they're going to say the wrong thing, for example. They're wondering what I'm doing there. Did their boss send them there? Or, are they? Is this a consultant coming in hoping to trim the fat in the organization, etc.? So what I'll often do is go in and follow this kind of master-apprentice model. That is, I'll tell them, I know very little about, in this case, flying general aviation aircraft. I know a few of the basics. I've tried to read up, but I've got a lot to learn about this. Would you just sort of treat me like I'm your apprentice? And I'm going to ask a lot of naive questions. I'll try not to annoy you too much, but I would like you to tell me everything you're thinking as you're going through and doing this. And it's surprising, people actually appreciate this. So they sort of know, now they've got a model that they can follow. Well, I know what an apprentice does. I know what the master does with the apprentice. I try to teach that person. And they try to teach you as much as possible as you go along. And you insert some questions along the way, but you sort of follow this model. So usually in real life, apprentices learn by watching, asking questions, trying to understand why things are done in certain ways, and that's what you'll do too. And then transferring knowledge about the work happens when people talk about how they do the work while they're doing the work instead of afterwards. So that's the idea. In this particular case, I couldn't do this. So this was for general aviation. And I said, well, remember, I'm not an expert in general aviation. I said, I know what I'll do. I'll fly around with general aviation experts or general aviation pilots, and I'll ask them questions while we're flying, which made perfect sense to me. But you can't hear a damn thing in there. I mean, it's so loud, and it just didn't work out well. So what I ended up doing, I tried that a couple times, like, oh, this just isn't going to work. But almost all of these little airports, general aviation airports, have a little greasy spoon restaurant there where the pilots gather afterwards and talk about their day and have coffee and, a burger and so forth. So I said, well, at least we can do that. We'll go there, I'll buy them a burger and a soda or whatever and ask them, well, interview them there. And the reason was, at least it was fresh in their memory, the whole, flying that we did. So I still flew with them, but then afterwards I would interview them here. Yep.
Would it have been better if you used like a simulator?
Sometimes. I think we could have used a simulator, but there's so much stuff that you wouldn't have in the simulator that they had. Mm-hmm. So for example, and a lot of this now is in electronic format, but he's showing me a lot of the materials that are involved in flying or that were involved in flying. And they include things like, I don't have a video of him, mapping out, or plotting out the map they're going to follow. It includes what they call, tables, something table. I'll have to think about it. But they're basically things they put on their knees and watch while they're flying into an airport so that they know what the approach, in fact, the approach plates is what they're called. And we wouldn't have necessarily had that in the simulator. So there's a lot of stuff that exists in the natural habitat that doesn't exist in the simulator. Yep. The simulator's cool because it's controlled.
Yeah.
So we like that as psychologists, right? Isn't this great? But you lose a lot of the richness. So I'm going to recommend a book to you guys, if you get a chance, in all your spare time, called Cognition in the Wild. And it's written by a fellow named E.H. Hutchins, Ed Hutchins. And he's a professor at UCSD, University of California at San Diego. And a lot of his research was dealing with exactly what you're talking about. Does it make sense to do work studying people in simulators, or is it better to study them in the real world? I know he's done a fair amount of simulation work, but he really likes the real world. Yep. So I think what I'll do, again, we're falling behind a little bit, but I think we'll be able to pick it up. Why don't we finish up here today, and then we'll catch up again on Tuesday, and we'll go through the rest of these slides. I always find with classes, I always think the introduction is like, this is still a little bit of introduction, is going to be faster than it is. But I think the introduction lays the groundwork for everything else. So, so I guess we'll just keep piling along.